Tonight, we've been hearing from Luke and David over the last several weeks now, how they've recounted for us the events that took part in John's account of the ministry of Jesus. And we've been following Jesus on his travels throughout Israel, from his baptism by John at Bethany beyond the Jordan, which is just around here. And then he journeyed up to the wedding at Cana in Galilee, so all the way up to here, and changed water into wine. And then he went up to Jerusalem for the first Passover of his ministry, where he drove the money changers out of the temple and the sacrifice sellers who were basically making the temple a little bit of a farmyard. And then he met Nicodemus, and he laid out to him clearly what being born again actually means. Now, last week David talked of the time he spent in Judea, and then where the knowledge of him had grown to the extent that his disciples were baptizing more people than John's disciples had been. And then he traveled up from Judea up towards Galilee. And we saw last week Jesus meeting with the woman of Samaria at Sychar, so in here, and the effect that had on the people of that region and the city, and what it meant to that area a couple of years later in the future, when Philip went there and preached the gospel, and the gospel was embraced in a way that was quite fantastic. Yeah, open arms, many believed. And tonight we're going to continue to follow Jesus' travels, because after these events he went and meets with a nobleman or a royal official at Cana. So we're going to pick it up from John 4:43. And it says this: Now after the 2 days he departed from there and went to Galilee. For Jesus himself testified that a prophet has no honor in his own country. So when he came to Galilee, the Galileans received him, having seen all the things he did in Jerusalem at the feast. For they had also gone to the feast. So Jesus came again to Cana of Galilee, where he had made the water wine. And there was a certain nobleman whose son was sick at Capernaum. And when he heard that Jesus had come out of Judea into Galilee, he went to him and implored him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. And then Jesus said to him, Unless you people see signs and wonders, you will by no means believe. The nobleman said to him, Sir, come down before my child dies. And Jesus said to him, Go your way, your son lives. So the man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him, and he went his way. And as he was going down, his servants met him and told him, saying, Your son lives. Then he inquired of them the hour when he got better. And they said to him, Yes, dear, at the 7th hour the fever left him. So the father knew it was the same hour in which Jesus said to him, Your son lives. And he himself believed, and his whole household. This again is a second sign that Jesus did when he'd come out of Judea into Galilee. So, I'll go back on that one. Verses 43 and 45 seem a little strange, having verse 44 in the middle. It does to me. You've got verse 43, now after 2 days he departed from there and then went to Galilee, and 45 says, So when he came to Galilee, the Galileans received him, having seen all the things he did in Jerusalem at the feast, for they'd also gone to the feast. So, and then you got 44 in the middle. For Jesus himself testified that a prophet has no honor in his own country. So it seems a bit strange having that in the middle of those two. Yeah. After 2 days teaching, he's well received. Yeah. Verse 45 mentions the arrival in Galilee, where there doesn't seem to be any indication of any rejection of Jesus' ministry. So what's John meaning by the remark that he puts down in verse 44? Well, if we have a look at the map again, perhaps the most reasonable one, if you look at where things are, Capernaum's up there, Cana's down here, Nazareth is here, and they were at Sychar. So perhaps the most reasonable thing is that Jesus is returning to the region of Galilee but not to his hometown of Nazareth. Verse 46 says, returned to the town of Cana. Nazareth, however, is closer, and it's actually on the road. Yeah? And Jesus would have passed right by it on his journey, and yet he didn't go there. He goes on to Cana. It seems likely that John is saying that the reason Jesus did that was because there was little point in going there, because the people there had no particular interest in hearing his words. Yeah? Other gospel writers quoted him as saying for their books, for example in Matthew 13, is this not the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary, and his brothers James, Joseph, Simon and Judas, and his sisters, are they not with us? Where then did this man get these things? So they were offended at him. But Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his own country and in his own house. Now he did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. He bypassed Nazareth. The response of the rest of Galilee seems to be very different, and quite different from the religious leaders in Jerusalem as well. It looks like they'd been there in Jerusalem at the Passover, and they'd seen all of the things that Jesus had done, and his fame was growing in that area. So we're going to pick up at verse 46. So Jesus came again to Cana of Galilee, where he'd made the water wine, and there was a certain nobleman whose son was sick at Capernaum. And when they heard that Jesus had come out of Judea into Galilee, he went to him and implored him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. So Jesus has arrived in Cana, and news of his arrival must have created quite a sensation, because it seems not very long afterwards, this nobleman seeks out Jesus and asks him to return with him back to Capernaum to perform a miracle to heal his son. Now, did he travel down from Capernaum to Cana? Or was he already there doing something in Cana? I don't know. We don't know. It doesn't say. But for whatever reason, he seeks him out. He's heard of him. And the nobleman obviously believes that Jesus has some kind of miraculous powers. Otherwise, he wouldn't have sought him out at Cana. And then Jesus says to him, unless you people see signs and wonders, you'll by no means believe. But the nobleman says to him in response to that, sir, come down before my child dies. I can feel with him that kind of thought. Yeah, my child is potentially dying. He's a few miles up the road, but he's potentially dying, and you're the only way that he's actually going to live. And Jesus says to him something quite interesting. Go your way, your son lives. Doesn't say anything else. He says, go your way, your son lives. And so the man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him, and he went his way. These seem very short sentences for what transpires around what's going on. Jesus' response to the man seems almost to be a bit harsh. Yeah? Until we actually look at the Greek of those sentences. And we see that in verse 48, when he says, unless you people see signs and wonders, you'd be by no means believe. The you people is actually plural. So he's not talking just, perhaps, to the man, but to the crowd around. Whoever is around him when this man catches up with him. He's not really addressing that person individually. What he's criticizing is the general attitude that people are looking for signs and wonders rather than having faith. And he's looking for that kind of faith from that man. But so this crowd can actually see real faith in action, he actually says, go your way, your son lives. And it's now in the man's hands. Does he believe what Jesus has said, or is he just hoping that it's true? Walking away without Jesus accompanying him back to Capernaum will require him to make the decision. And because he really does trust that what Jesus has just said is true. He prepares to make his journey home. Now, Capernaum is about 16 miles from Cana, so about 5 hours walking time probably. And it's already probably too late in the day to start that journey. So he doesn't set out until the next morning, because you don't travel at night if you can avoid it in those days. And now, as he's going down towards Capernaum, his servants meet him and told him, saying, "Your son lives." And he inquires of them the hour when he got better, and they said to him, "Yesterday at the 7th hour when the fever left him." So the father knew it was at the same hour in which Jesus had said to him, "Your son lives," and he believed, and his whole household. This again is the second sign that Jesus did when he came out of Judea into Galilee. The man's response to Jesus was an act of faith. He not only believed, but he acted on what he believed. Yeah, he put his trust in Jesus, which is what it means to put faith in Jesus. That didn't mean he got the answer he wanted straight away. In fact, verse 52 refers to the moment of healing as yesterday. So he's been with Jesus one day, and it's the next day when he's actually meeting with his servants on the road. So the man had to wait a long time to find out whether God had actually granted his request. And I think that's as applicable to us today as it was then. Real biblical faith requires trust, not simply knowledge or hope. We need to understand that simply because we can't see every detail, it doesn't mean that God's done nothing. He can work and answer our prayers in ways we won't find out about until much later. I remember reading a book by Watchman Nee a long time back. And somebody came to Watchman Nee and said, "I've been praying for my neighbour for them to become a Christian." And Watchman Nee said, "Well, for how long?" And he said, "I don't know, a couple of years." And Watchman Nee said something along the lines of, "I've been praying for my neighbours for 25 years. Sometimes you don't see the effects that are actually happening. And sometimes you won't see. You'll have gone, you'll have moved on. And then God will have moved. Yeah? But it doesn't mean that it isn't happening. From the other Gospels, you know that Jesus then spent some time ministering in Galilee. Though John doesn't mention all the things that Jesus did in that period, the other Gospels detail many things that he did, many miraculous signs. But this was the second sign specifically in Galilee. So that brings us to the end of chapter 4. Now, sometime later, Jesus goes again to Jerusalem. Yeah, for a feast of the Jews. Now, it may be Pentecost, it may be trumpets, or one of the other festivals in the latter part of the year. Yeah, you can see where he was earlier, where he began his ministry, was back over here, and we're probably somewhere in here. Which one, we don't know, because it just says a festival of the Jews. But it's probably going to have to be one of the significant ones, because he goes up to Jerusalem, and those are the ones where you have to go to Jerusalem. Jesus seems to have followed the halakha that laid out the Jewish customs and traditions and observed all the festivals, so it's no surprise that he's back in Jerusalem again for one of the important festivals. It's now some months since that Passover where he started his ministry, driving the money changers out of the temple. So we start in chapter 5. And after this, there's a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. And in these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. And then whoever stepped in first, after the stirring of the water, was made well of whatever disease he had. Now a certain man was there who had an infirmity 38 years. And when Jesus saw him lying there, and knew he'd already been in that condition a long time, he said to him, or the way that the Greek says, he says to him, because it's the historical present, it tries to make it in the moment for you. So when you're actually reading it, it's not as if it's in the past. So Jesus says to him, "Do you want to be made well?" And the sick man answered, "Sir, I've no man to put me in the pool when the water's stirred up, but while I'm coming, another steps down before me." And Jesus says to him, "Rise, take up your bed and walk." And immediately the man was made well and took up his bed and walked, and that day was the Sabbath. And the Jews therefore said to him who was cured, "It's the Sabbath. It's not lawful for you to carry your bed." He answered them, "He who made me well said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" And then they asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" But the one who was healed didn't know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, a multitude being in that place. And afterward, Jesus finds him in the temple and says to him, "See, you've been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you." And the man departed and told the Jews it was Jesus who had made him well. For this reason, the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him, because he'd done these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father's been working until now, and I've been working." So, John describes things as you would expect an eyewitness to do for readers who hadn't actually been to Jerusalem. He's trying to set a scene for us all. Yeah? I haven't been there. Lots of you have been there. Right? So you've seen some of the historical ruins. You can see where things are with relation to each other. But this is a little bit of a picture of where things are in terms of the Pool of Bethesda, with reference to the North Temple Wall and the Antonine Fortress, which is that bit, the Roman fortress. And the Sheep Gate is over here somewhere. Right? So the Sheep Gate is no doubt the same gate through which the sheep travelled on their way to be sacrificed at the temple. And it's described in Nehemiah when they rebuilt the walls of the city of Jerusalem. Yeah? In Nehemiah 3, verses 1 and 2, it says, "Then Eliashib the high priest rose up with his brethren the priests and built the Sheep Gate. They consecrated it and hung its doors. They built as far as the Tower of 100 and consecrated it, and then as far as the Tower of Hananel. Next to Eliashib, the men of Jericho built. Next to them, Zaccur, the son of Imri, built," and so on. And the Pool of Bethesda was quite close to that gate, just northwest of the temple precincts and located beside the Roman Antonine Fort. And if we go back to the actual text of it, yeah, you'll notice that I put some things down in a different colour there, right? Some of the early texts are going to say different things here. But let's have a look at the actual Pool of Bethesda. The early manuscripts give lots of different spellings for this pool, yeah. But most English translations give it as Bethesda, which comes from the Hebrew Beth-Hesda, which can mean house of mercy or house of grace. And probably called it that because of the mercy of God for the sick and the diseased. But it's also interesting that the Hebrew can actually be translated in an entirely different way. It can be translated as disgrace or shame. So house of disgrace, house of shame. And maybe the presence of so many sick people camped there in the eyes of the people and the religious authorities prompted that kind of interpretation of the name. Which one it was, we don't know. So just a little history now. This is the Pool of Bethesda, as recreated in the model of the city of Jerusalem that's in Jerusalem. So the Pool of Bethesda is actually discovered in the late 19th century under the ruins of a Byzantine church. And they show a pool that's roughly rectangular. And I say roughly rectangular because for some reason it's not exactly the kind of nice little walled pool that you might have expected. It varies from about 50 to 60 meters wide, so this bit is about 50 and some of this bit's about 60 meters wide. And the whole lot is around about 96 meters long for the whole thing. And it's divided into two pools by a central partition. Southern pool has broad steps and landings, indicating it's probably a mikvah, or ritual bath, similar to the pool of Siloam at the south end of the city, where Jerusalem's pilgrims would gather to purify themselves for worship. The northern part of the pool provides a sort of reservoir to continually replenish and repurify the southern pool, where you actually step in and wash yourself. And then the water flows out from there. Fresh water is always flowing south through the dam between them. Now, John describes 5 porches, so a series of columns built at regular intervals, supporting a roof structure of the kind that's shown here. And that sounds like it's probably a rather strange design if you look at the text. The text basically says, it's got 5 porches, a pool with 5 porches. Maybe it's an unusual 5-sided pool. And that strange design suggested to an awful lot of biblical scholars that all of this was unhistorical and discounted the entire passage as untrue. Yet when this site was excavated, it revealed this rectangular pool with 2 basins separated by a wall, and so you actually get 5 sides that actually had a porch. One up there, one over there, one over there, that one there, and this one here. This one doesn't have porches. 5-sided pool. But they dismissed it because they hadn't actually seen it until the 19th century. So weather permitting, people would sit under those covered porches to be sheltered from the sun. But pilgrims to the city aren't the only ones who come to richly bathe in the pool of Bethesda. It's also said to be a center of healing, for John explains, in those days lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, and paralyzed. And why they're there is then explained to make the reason for the gathering clear to the readers. It's interesting that this explanation isn't included in an awful lot of the early Greek manuscripts. It's only in the footnotes of a lot of Bibles. It's not in the one that we've got, that we've been following. But it's extremely helpful in shedding light on the common idea of the miraculous at that time and the way that some pools throughout Israel and the wider Roman Empire were thought to possess healing powers. It perhaps hasn't changed a great deal from then to now. When you see people traveling to religious sites or churches in the hope of a miracle simply from attending, being there, stepping down into some water, wherever it happens to be. At the time, they were waiting for the moving of the water, as they thought of it. An angel went down from a certain time at the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first after the stirring, the water was made well of whatever disease he had. So that description of the healing by the angel, occasionally stirring up the water, was obviously believed by many of the sick. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been sat around the pool. They huddled around the pool and pinned their hopes on the chance that they might be the first to get into the water. Who actually said this in the first place? The first one in is going to get healed, the rest of you tough. Who knows? We're not told how many sick people were gathered on any given day, but you can imagine there's probably hundreds. And only one of them's actually going to be expected to be healed, expected to gain any benefit from being there. There's going to be an awful lot of people disappointed on a daily basis. It's also worth knowing that giving to the needy is a statutory religious obligation for all the Jews. So it's very convenient, if you like to put it that way, to have a public place where you might also be going to be ritually cleansed, because you can then undertake your obligations to provide for the needy and cleanse yourself at the same time. The poor and needy are there. You need to be richly cleansed. Go and give some alms to the poor. Get richly cleansed. Away you go, off to the temple. But a certain man's there. John introduces us to the subject of Jesus' healing that day. Of all the people gathered at the poolside that day, Jesus selects this one man. How he selects him? The way that Jesus tended to select everybody. He'd already heard, I would imagine. Now, a certain man's there who had an infirmity for 38 years. We're not told what that man's infirmity was. He's referred to as an invalid in the NIV and ESV. He had an infirmity in the New King James Version. It basically means he had a debilitating illness, sickness, disease. And we can assume that he's not merely lame, making his way around on crutches, but paralyzed. He must be, because he's lying on a mat and he couldn't get into the water very easily by himself. So he's one of the least able of all those waiting around the pool for the hoped for stirring the waters. I suppose that some people, perhaps his relatives or his neighbours, carried him to the pool every morning and home every night. But during the day, they'd probably need to work in order to support themselves and him, if they're his family. And there's no one else he could rely on, so he doesn't have a friend at his side to help him into the pool. And when Jesus saw him lying there, he knew that he'd already been in that condition a long time. And again, in the historical present, Jesus says, he says to him, "Do you want to be made well?" So Jesus comes up to you and says, "Do you want to be made well?" The Greek is literally, "Do you desire to get well?" Now, that might seem a rather strange thing of Jesus to ask a man, seeing as he'd been lying there for, presumably, every day for goodness knows how long, 38 years. And been hoping for a miracle, if he only could get to the water first. But perhaps it's that Jesus wants more than a bit of a yes-no answer to this question. He's assessing the man's real desire and faith. He's asking if he wants to change the way his life has been, from being provided for by his friends and relatives and whatever charity he gets around the pool, to having to actually provide for himself again, if he's actually healed there and then. Perhaps Jesus asks us the same question. Do we want to be healed? Do we want to be released from things that we become accustomed to or learn to live with? Perhaps for you and me, any of those flaws in our character that only we or those closest to us know about and that God's highlighted, but which it's hard to let go of. Do we want to be healed? It's not an easy question necessarily. But the sick man answered him, "Sir, I've no man to put me in the pool when the water stirred up, but while I'm coming, another steps down before me." The man either obviously doesn't know or recognize Jesus as a result of the other signs he'd done on the previous Passover, or he doesn't understand, at least initially, that Jesus isn't apportioning any blame to him or fault as why he's not managed to be healed over all the time that he's laying around the pool, all the 38 years of his illness. And Jesus isn't also talking about helping him into the water at the appointed time, but he's actually asking, do you want to be healed? Right here, right now, now. In either case, Jesus presents him with something he isn't expecting. He doesn't pray for him. He doesn't say, just lie there and I'll put my hand on you and you'll be healed. He commands him. He says, rise, take up your bed and walk. And immediately the man was made well, took up his bed and walked. Whatever his initial thoughts on what Jesus was saying, the command that Jesus did, rise, take up your bed and walk, had such authority that it left him in no doubt that the man standing above him not only had the ability to make him well, but he was actually commanding his healing. It seems that his body was made well instantaneously, as the Greek of that verse describes it as happening kai euthos, literally meaning right away or at once. So there's no time lapse here. There's no, I'll pray for you, 2 days later you get healed. This is, rise, take up your bed and walk, and you are healed. And he picks up his bed and walks away from the pool, just as he's been told to do. Now, I find it interesting that Jesus is choosing that man who'd been crippled for 38 years and having his healing happen instantaneously in response to his command must have left no doubt that what had happened was a miracle, because many around the pool would have seen it and known that the man had lain there for decades, that had lain next to him. That's George. George is the guy who's been here for 38 years. Yeah. Oh, he's always there. He's always in that part of the pool. And today, suddenly he stands up and walks, and he's never been able to walk for 38 years. So I've no doubt that would have caused a bit of a stir, not just around the pool, but it would have then gone out from the pool. People would have been saying, there's been this miracle. This guy's suddenly been healed. He was paralyzed, but suddenly he's walking out of the pool. And the day was a Sabbath. Now, not only was it the Sabbath, but it's the Sabbath in a feast. And so to all the Jews, it's a really doubly special day. And the Pharisees, with their strict interpretation of the law of Moses, that meant no work to be undertaken from the sunset at the start of the feast to the sunset at the end of the feast. And it being a Sabbath too, no work, no chance. Yeah. And you can see from this table that virtually all of the festivals, the day of the festival was defined as a Sabbath, irrespective of what day it fell on. So it didn't need to be the normal Sabbath, the seventh day in their calendar. But whatever day it was in the festival, it was virtually always a Sabbath, and definitely so for all of the major ones. You can be sure that there would have been lots of people around who were not only scandalized at the thought of anybody doing any work on the Sabbath or during a feast, but many of them would have been calling for a very strict interpretation of the laws about the Sabbath and call for at least the scourging of anyone caught breaking the law. The law is very clear about observing the Sabbath. The fourth commandment saying in Exodus, remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, nor you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your strangers within your gates. In Jeremiah it says, thus says the Lord, take heed to yourselves and burden no burden on the Sabbath day, nor bring it into the gates of Jerusalem, nor carry a burden out of your houses on the Sabbath day, nor do any work, but hallow the Sabbath day as I commanded your fathers. Yeah. And the law was very clear that breaking the Sabbath was a capital offense, as written in Exodus. Work should be done for 6 days, but the seventh is a Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It's a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. Even minor tasks, such as gathering wood, was prohibited, as in Numbers 15. This man here who's gathering sticks, and they brought him before Moses and Aaron and all the congregation, and they put him initially under guard because they didn't know what to do with him, and then the Lord says to Moses, he must surely be put to death. And they take him out and stone him. So there's a lot of the law that they've been versed in for generations that basically says the Sabbath is holy, you shall do no work. Of course, it's interesting sometimes what actually happens. Over the course of the years since the Exodus, the rabbinic lawyers and the priests have pored over and reviewed all the laws and started detailing just what and what wasn't allowed in the Sabbath. Yeah? So they look at what's actually there, and then they start adding bits and taking slightly bits away. So, for example, it's allowable to carry a man on a bed on the Sabbath. That's okay. But to carry a bed on the Sabbath, that's not okay. So, bed with a man on, fine. Bed without a man, not a very good idea. I also find it quite interesting what God does sometimes. Having said all of these things to the children of Israel, in Joshua, the Lord says to Joshua, "See, I've given Jericho into your hands. Its king and the mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city. All of you, men of war, you shall go around the city once. This you shall do 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. But the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. It shall come to pass, when they've made a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, that all the people shall shout with a great shout. Then the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up every man straight before him." On the 7th day of their walking around. So, to me, there's no doubt in that passage that people are carrying weapons. The Ark of the Covenant is being carried around. Trumpets and probably other things are being carried around. And they must have done so over a Sabbath, because it's 7 consecutive days. Interesting. Perhaps it goes towards what Jesus then goes on to say. So, surely a healed man carrying home his stretcher, that's not work, is it? But to those steeped in the law, you look only at what it's actually saying. You must carry it out to the minutest detail. The first response on seeing this man carrying something on the Sabbath was, in their eyes, normal. It basically was, it's the Sabbath. It's not lawful to do that. It's not lawful for you to carry your bed. Now, he who has been healed also knew what the law said about work on the Sabbath. He's a Jew. He's been versed in it since his childhood. He doesn't want to get himself into serious trouble with the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin. So he answers them and says, "Well, it wasn't me. It's he who made me well. He told me, take up your bed and walk." We've probably all done that at times in the past, probably as little children. It wasn't me, it was him. Or it was her. Yeah? But he had a choice to make here. And he says, "He who made me well said to me, take up your bed and walk." And they asked him, "Well, who's this man who said to you, take up your bed and walk?" I find it really interesting that in John's account that the first response of these people wasn't amazement that someone's healed this man who's been paralyzed for 38 years, but wanting to know who told him to break the law. Here's a guy who you remember seeing George. He was the guy who sat in the laid in the corner of the porches in the pool of Bethesda, and you've always seen him because you go down to the mikvah and you get yourself nice and clean, and you give some alms to the poor and you give some money to George, and here he is, standing in front of you, bed in hand, and the first thing you say is, "Who told you to carry that?" Rather than, "You're healed." Really? I find it interesting. I think it's highly likely those asking the questions, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, already had a reasonable idea of who had healed man. I mean, who else is it going to be? They probably heard that he's in Jerusalem, because word gets around. Word got around in Cana, and Cana's a much smaller town. And he didn't do the miracles there necessarily that he'd done in Jerusalem back at the Passover. But the one who's healed didn't know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, a multitude being in that place. So there's a lot of people around, and Jesus had disappeared. He doesn't know who it is. So I also find it very interesting that the man who's healed didn't even learn Jesus' name. You might have expected him to be grateful and ask who it was who'd healed him. Yeah, but that doesn't seem to be the case. It looks like his only thought was his own healing, not one of thanksgiving to the healer. Yeah, just get up, go. Not even a thank you very much. It's just out the door. Perhaps that's something that we can all individually learn from this account too. It's easy to ask for God's grace or healing and then not to be thankful when it actually appears. I also find it very interesting that Jesus has withdrawn. He hasn't used this spectacular event to promote himself, even though many around the pool must have realized that something amazing had happened. This man had gotten up from his bed and walked away. Later on, we aren't told when by John, so it may well have been the same day or sometime afterwards. Jesus sees this man in the temple. This is interesting, as it's not the other way around, as Jesus is very likely to be standing there or sitting around talking with a group of people, teaching. Yeah. But Jesus finds him in the temple and says to him again, "See, you've been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come on you." Again, I find it a really interesting verse. Jesus confronts the man about his sin. We aren't told what that sin is, but he's told to stop it. If he doesn't want something worse than what he'd had to become of him. What he'd had was paralysis for 38 years, so something worse than paralysis for 38 years. Jesus doesn't always link sin to sickness or affliction, but in this case he does. And he's looking for real repentance, I think. What that sin is, I don't know. It doesn't say. There's no point in speculating. For the man and for us, that something worse is a choice between life and death, an eternity with God or hell. But the man departs and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. So perhaps what Jesus had said to the man wasn't very well received, because he goes off straight away and tells the Pharisees that the man who'd healed him was Jesus. He was the one who told me to carry my bed, which seems in the circumstances quite a malicious thing to do. He passes on the blame and any punishment that's going to come from it for carrying the bed to Jesus in order to avoid it himself. He doesn't seem to have learnt anything from his encounter with Jesus, even though he's been physically healed. Physical healing doesn't necessarily mean healing of what's going on inside. I think we need to learn a lesson from that. And now the Pharisees know for certain who it was who healed the man and told him to carry his bed away. They seem incapable of seeing the miraculous thing that God's done here, even though it's been performed right before their eyes, because they're totally focused on their interpretation of the rules of the law, and so they begin their criticism, persecution of Jesus. So for this reason, the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him, because he'd done these things on the Sabbath. He'd angered the religious leaders by healing the man on the Sabbath. But rather than investigating the power that actually allowed Jesus to perform a miracle, the Pharisees criticized him for breaking the customs about the Sabbath. Persecution starts because he's got the audacity to do some good on the Sabbath. Heal somebody. How dare you heal somebody? How dare the grace of God come down on the Sabbath? Jesus is fulfilling the spirit of the law and not merely obeying the words. He saw the Sabbath as God's blessing to man and not the other way around. The Sabbath was meant to release the people of God from working every day of the week and to allow them to stop and think. Focus on God, look at what was important in life, and not merely continue the activities that provided for their existence. That's what God was trying to get over to them. Don't keep on working 24/7, 365, like our economy assumes that everybody does nowadays. Have a break. Take time out. Think about me. Think about the things that are important in life. As Mark records in Mark 2, 27 and 28, and he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus is greater than the Sabbath because it's Lord. And in the final part of this encounter that John writes about, Jesus gives the basis for his understanding of Sabbath observance. While the Pharisees have a fixed view about what it's just work about the Sabbath, Jesus says, my Father has been working until now, and I've been working. Now, that's not an entirely new idea in Judaism. Jesus was just reminding them of it. All the rabbis in Jesus' day knew that God works on the Sabbath. In fact, the priests serving in the temple worked on the Sabbath. Yeah? And if God didn't work on the Sabbath, then there would be a day a week when his grace and mercies weren't available. Jesus' point is that the Father works on the Sabbath, then he can also do his works on the Sabbath too. The problem is that statement is even more incendiary to the Pharisees than what he's done previously, because it sounds like blasphemy, as we're going to see in a couple of weeks' time when Luke takes us through the rest of the chapter. And we'll talk about equality and authority. Thank you.